BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery, and in this episode I will be discussing Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery, and some people might think that Lewis Carroll is an outlandish suspect. Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland and Jabberwocky. But I've always said, if someone has proposed a suspect, and if there's a body of work behind it, I will discuss that particular suspect. And also I want to do something that I do very frequently here on Black Box Online Radio, weigh the merits of the ideas, because as we're going to see with Lewis Carroll, there are some strong points, and there are some other points that I want to challenge. Before we go any further into this discussion, I would like to cite some sources that I will be discussing in this episode. And if you want to do any further listening to a program that looks at Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I highly recommend the Art of Crime podcast, which is hosted by Gavin Whitehead. I think that he did an excellent job on his Lewis Carroll Jack the Ripper episode. It was about 57 minutes long, but it was just filled with information, excellent presentation. Now, I would also like to thank the program Unrefined and the Cracked Sisters Conspiracy podcast. They also have a Lewis Carroll Jack the Ripper episode. But most of these people are using one particular source, and I think it's even fair to say that the largest proponent of this Lewis Carroll Jack the Ripper theory is an individual named Richard Wallace, who wrote the book Jack the Ripper, Lighthearted Friend. He literally wrote the book on the subject of Lewis Carroll being Jack the Ripper, and longtime followers of Black Box Online Radio will remember that I used to do a segment called The Jack the Ripper Report, and I've mentioned a few of Richard Wallace's observations in the past, but this is an episode when I really wanted to get under the surface and look at Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And if you want to follow along with all of these discussions, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio. Is there a Jack the Ripper suspect that you would like discussed here on Ripper Wednesday? Is there another aspect of the Ripper case that you would like discussed? For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and as always, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And if you want to support any of these efforts, you can go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnet88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. So let's give the most basic Wikipedia-style introduction to Lewis Carroll. He is definitely more famous for being an accomplished writer, poet, storyteller, as well as someone who was a mathematician, somebody who was very good with anagrams and puzzles. He was born in January of 1832, and he passed away in January of 1898. As previously stated, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in 1888, and Lewis Carroll passed away in January just prior to his 66th birthday. He was 65 years old when he passed away. So that means that in 1888, for the Autumn of Terror, Jack the Ripper's activities would have gone from August 31st with the murder of Polly Nichols to November 9th of 1888 with the murder of Mary Kelly. Lewis Carroll would have been 56 years old at the time of these crimes, and I'm going to be very honest with you guys, 56 is a little bit old for a Jack the Ripper suspect, and I think that a lot of the other witness sightings, the few witness sightings that we do have, indicate that the Ripper was much closer to 30 rather than 50, and we also have psychological profiles that have been created for Jack the Ripper, even by people such as the FBI profiler John Douglas, who estimate that the Ripper was late 20s and early 30s, although I fully confess those things are not certifiable. But right now, I would like to play a clip of the Unrefined podcast, and let's listen to them talk about Richard Wallace and his observations on Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect.
In 1996, author Richard Wallace put out a book called Jack the Ripper, Lighthearted Friend. And in that book, Wallace proposes his theory that Lewis Carroll could have been Jack the Ripper all along. Carroll was known to be a pretty gentle person, as well as a teacher. He taught math at Oxford until the day that he died in 1898. Wallace himself is kind of like a Carroll fan, a Carroll expert. They call him a Carroll scholar. He comes up with his own theory. He claims that Carroll had a nervous breakdown and in fact had a separate persona. And that separate persona is Jack the Ripper. The book that he wrote, again, it's called Jack the Ripper, Lighthearted Friend. It came out in 96. You can get it right now. You can find it on Amazon and stuff like that. But that book suggests that this psychotic break that he had came from years of abuse that Carroll took from older boys when he was in school, and it damaged him enough. So naturally, what does he do? Takes out his vengeance on prostitutes. But it wouldn't be too shocking if he was taking it out on prostitutes. One, it's an easy target. They're soliciting you, they're coming up to you, and they're bringing you places and everything like that. So you could easily target them and take advantage of them. Also, he was a lifelong bachelor, so it wouldn't be too out of the ordinary that he may be looking for a lady of the night. But the bigger question is he Jack the Ripper? Is Lewis Carroll Jack the Ripper?
Where's the evidence? I want to see it. Lay it on me.
Carroll was pretty famous for his anagrams and wordplay in his books. Anybody who's read any of the Lewis Carroll stuff can tell you that. Wallace's theory is mostly based on these anagrams and wordplay. He says that Carroll has hidden messages in his works that prove that he is Jack the Ripper. This is a passage from the book, and he just basically rearranges all the letters and makes new words from this one passage. It says, if I find one street whore, you know what will happen. 'Twill be off with her head. It's pretty interesting. Subscribe to Unrefined.
And one more time, those were the words of the Unrefined podcast, and you can get them on YouTube simply under the name Unrefined. But what do we make of some of these things? Here on Black Box Online Radio, I like to try and weigh the merit of the ideas. And one thing that was posted in the comments section, I know, great place to get your research right, but one thing that was posted was, some people were saying that they didn't think that Lewis Carroll lived close enough to Whitechapel to commit these murders, because they believed that Jack the Ripper was a Whitechapel resident. And I absolutely disagree with this type of thinking. And to be clear, this is not something that was stated from the Unrefined podcast. This was a commenter who responded to them, but you heard them talking about how he is in different parts of England, and I just don't particularly like that narrative. Yes, it's physically possible to go from one part of England to the next, and bear in mind there are significant time gaps between the activities of Jack the Ripper. Okay, so those are some things. And the next point would be that they are sharing this observation from Richard Wallace that Lewis Carroll would have experienced a mental breakdown, and you heard that that was done during his school years. But as I said at the beginning of the recording, Lewis Carroll would have been 56 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders. Well, some of them anyway. The Whitechapel murders went into the 1890s, but I digress from that. But how would that work if he experienced a mental breakdown during his school years, and he's 56 at the time of Jack the Ripper's creation? What's going on there? What I believe is, and if I understand what Richard Wallace is trying to say, is that he would have created Jack the Ripper as an alter ego. And I think a very good example of this is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I was talking about this on the Tuesday show. Every Tuesday I do a segment called True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And on the most recent one, I was responding to the documentary The Making of a Serial Killer. And they just flat out said it. Some serial killers like to go between personas. They go between different characters and parts that they are playing. And it's like a game to them in some ways. But I don't think that Richard Wallace was presenting it that way. I think he was presenting it as a way in looking at how Lewis Carroll, whose name was actually Charles Dodgson, was somebody who would create these different aspects of his personality as a way to deal with internalized ill feelings and rage. And that Jack is the one who handles all of the rage, and then Lewis is the one who handles the man of letters stuff, and I guess he can be Charles in his day-to-day life. And I think that that's perhaps a fair assessment of it. So it's something that he would have carried for the rest of his life. His dark side would simply be named Jack the Ripper, or his dark side would simply be named Jack. That's I think, a way we can call it. So this is something that isn't completely unheard of. There are lots of other serial killers that would experience something like that. And also, about experiencing abuse during his school years and carrying it on into his adulthood, the serial killer Joel Rifkin said some things that were really quite similar, that it wasn't so much abuse from his household that drove him to kill, but rather it was the experiences that he had being bullied by schoolmates, or it's hard to call them mates at all, by being bullied by people at school, which would have driven him to commit these types of crimes. All right, so I'm going to play another clip, and this one is going to come to us from the Cracked Sisters Conspiracy podcast. It's about 3 minutes long, but they're going to talk about some other evidence that Richard Wallace has.
To Wallace, Carroll regularly would sneak hidden messages into his letters and published works, and he started dissecting lines that Lewis Carroll had written. So as an example, this is where it starts to get.
We're going downhill real fucking quick.
Yeah. So in a passage that Carroll wrote, it said, "My dear Skeff, roar not lest thou be abolished." That shit doesn't make any sense to me, but I also am from our current time. So,
yeah,
whatever. Wallace then rearranged that sentence essentially to instead read, "Ask mother about the red lion. Safer boys fled." Again, that doesn't make any sense to me either.
No.
But apparently it meant something to Wallace, because he suspected that red lion that was mentioned in his translation referred to a game that was sexual in nature and was played at the boys' school that Lewis Carroll had attended. And he believes his mistreatment at rugby school fueled his overall hatred for and the need to get revenge on society. So that's what opened the floodgates for Jack the Ripper's persona to come out.
Has anyone investigated this guy? Because I feel like he is so hard projecting, and
Right.
he's Jack the Ripper.
I mean, considering that Jack the Ripper was in the 1800s and
this is the
1990s, so
Oh.
we're like 100 years apart. So
Okay,
we
I
know
missed
it
that
wasn't
part.
him.
But he's done something. Someone should
He
check
might
into
have
him.
someone, a body in a closet somewhere.
100%.
You're right. There's probably some cause there.
Yeah, he's projecting really hard.
Yeah, so to kind of keep that crazy ball rolling, so he then goes on to claim that Lewis Carroll confessed to the murders in his books, in the things that he had written in his, plays and poems and stuff. So as an example, he referred to a scene from a young children's book called The Nursery Alice, and that read, "So we went to the cook and we got her to make a saucer full of nice oatmeal porridge. And then we called Dash into the house and we said, 'Now, Dash, you're going to have your birthday treat.' We expected Dash would jump for joy, but it didn't one bit." So I'm like, in a kid's book, whatever, that I guess could, vibe.
Yeah.
But Wallace, he rearranged the words again.
Who has time for this?
Someone who is a part-time Lewis Carroll scholar.
It's like a full-time fucking psycho.
He is, and he's a social worker. So I'm
God.
I'm questioning his mental,
Yeah.
abilities. So his rearranged version.
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, we Thomas Bain, Charles Dogson, coited into the slain nude body, expected to taste, devour, enjoy a nice meal of a dead whore's uterus. We made do, found it awful, wan and tough like a worn, dirty goat hog. We both threw it out, Jack the Ripper."
I'm calling people goat hogs from now on. If you piss me off, goat hog.
Right? I mean, that is a very descriptive.
And one more time, those were the words of the Cracked Sisters Conspiracy podcast. Even though I don't agree with everything that everyone says, no matter whom they are, no matter which person it is from any of these sources, sometimes I think other people can have very interesting insights. And you may have noticed that those two ladies zoned in on a particular aspect of this story that I would never have thought of, and that is that they thought that Richard Wallace was projecting some of his own mental health issues onto this story, and he was incorporating things from his own life into these accusations against Lewis Carroll. And I was very surprised by that because, I mean, that's just something that I wouldn't have thought of. And I also fully admit that that's an assumption. But here's another assumption. This whole thing about how Lewis Carroll is just carrying around Jack the Ripper as his alter ego dark side persona, purely an assumption based on the part of Richard Wallace. And this goes beyond that because I think that it's fair to say these things about about Lewis Carroll being bullied at school, having a terrible experience at the place that he went to called the rugby school. All right, that's fair. That's something that it appears that there is physical historical evidence to support, and there are biographies that are on Lewis Carroll. He also wrote numerous letters in his diaries, all of that stuff. But just, his trying to look at his writings and get some type of window into his soul and making this Jack the Ripper connection is very assumptive. Moving on to the next point, and this will become the biggest foundation of any accusation against Lewis Carroll and him being Jack the Ripper, and that relates to these anagram solutions. And I told you guys that I wanted to weigh the merit of the ideas, and I really hope you don't think that I'm going to be purely dismissive, because I actually think that Richard Wallace has some good points here, or at the very least, they are shocking points and shocking coincidences involving these anagram solutions. And I think that first I'll give the kind of problems that I have with anagrams. As many of you know, I do a regular segment about the Zodiac Killer every Monday here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with different true crime stories. I also talk about D.B. Cooper on Fridays. But as far as these anagrams go, they come up in the Zodiac Killer case a lot. Now, last year, somebody released a book called Catching Zodiac. It's written by a reporter named Dale Julin, who centered his Zodiac Killer investigation on anagrams, taking the letters and correspondences and cards written by the Zodiac Killer and rearranging the letters to get new sentences. Like he would take the Zodiac Killer's Halloween card and he would rearrange the letters to get some very, very elaborate sentences, such as Nurse Donna Lass is up in a tree. Aye, aye, Captain Gary Francis Post on the Hootin' Tootin' MS Dixie. Like, we're talking about, taking a block of text and reshaping it into a completely different meaning. And you might be thinking, okay, maybe maybe he's onto something. Well, if he is, why did Harriet Suchet write a book called The World According to Jack Torrance when she does the exact same thing with Jack Torrance's personal writings, rearranges the letters, and gets these solutions that indicate that Jack Torrance was the Zodiac Killer? And as I just said, Dale Julin's suspect is named Gary Post. That aye, Captain Gary Francis Post. Well, is the Zodiac Killer Gary Francis Post or Jack Torrance? This can be done with the appropriate amount of cleverness. And some of the ones that were created by Richard Wallace are rather impressive. There's one where he even talks about cutting out a woman's uterus, and Jack the Ripper cut out the uterus of multiple victims. So I think that he has done this with some very, very strong insights. And as you heard in that clip from the Crack Sisters conspiracy, Richard Wallace is a psychotherapist and social worker. And it seems like he is somewhat of a smart individual, but the more important question is, was his suspect Jack the Ripper? And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. Anagrams don't necessarily impress me too much because, as I said, I've experienced this in other cases, and it's just rearranging letters to get a desired result. Next point. When I was a teenager, this is back in 2001, 2002, I think, there was this story that came in the news that the computers had reshaped Moby Dick into a new anagram. And we didn't use terms like AI, we didn't say computer generated, we didn't say algorithmically designed, they just said the computers did it. That's how they would break this down in the news. And they would say that computers have reshaped the story of Moby Dick, like the novel about the white whale, Herman Melville and all that, and they turned it into a new set of English words. And it was a grammatically correct anagram, of Moby Dick, and it was listed as the world's largest anagram at the time. That's what the news story was saying. A computer created the world's largest anagram, taking Moby Dick and putting it into New English sentences. Well, that's an entire novel that can be reshaped doing this exact same method. So, I mean, that doesn't impress me at all. Now, there is a particular line, though, from the Crack Sisters that I would like to respond to, because on a recent Ripper Wednesday, I was talking to you guys about the girl in the blue dress. And there's a YouTube channel out there called Girl in a Blue Dress, and this is, her presentation, and I'm going to play a clip from her YouTube channel in a second because she deserves full credit for articulating this. And it talks about how the girl in the blue dress is a literary figure that shows up multiple times, even in the 20th century, with some of the characters that we see on film. Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, Wendy from Peter Pan, and Alice in Wonderland, who was created in the 1800s. And with these characters, they are depicted as girls who wear blue dresses because they are innocent, they are gentle, nurturing, and they live mundane lives. Then they go on this adventure in some type of fantasy land. Of course, Alice in Wonderland, right? And Dorothy is going to Oz, and Wendy goes to Neverland. And then they come back from the adventure, and no one believes their story 100%. You guys get the idea, if you've seen those movies or read the stories. Now, the stories for, say, for example, The Wizard of Oz is very different, the one that was created by L. Frank Baum. But we don't need to talk about that right now. And what I want to share, though, is no matter what we say about Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect, he has a different type of creativity that I did not appreciate in the past, and I'm going to share that segment from Girl in a Blue Dress right here.
Adventures in Wonderland. Basically, Lewis Carroll, what inspired him to write this, and how, really, when you look at it, that book, every element has a real-world application, which I find so fascinating because you look at that story, and it seems so nonsensical. It looks total gibberish. You read the Jabberwocky, sounds like you're having a stroke. But really, for a story that seems like nonsense, it is actually so based in reality. And I think to do that, to base something so in reality but come off so unrealistic, is a feat that is beautiful that Lewis Carroll was able to do. And I talked a lot about that, how Lewis Carroll, aka Charles Dodgson, which, yeah, Lewis Carroll was a pen name. Fun, he was a mathematician. I could recite my senior thesis, but I don't want to get too into that because I could easily get into that, but I won't. But anyway.
And one more time, that was from the YouTube channel, Girl in a Blue Dress, and she has other videos that talk about her mental health issues, but this is one where she was talking about her ideas in regards to literature, which I think were absolutely amazing. And in the past, I didn't necessarily appreciate Lewis Carroll that much. When I would listen to things like Jabberwocky, and it says, "'Twas Brillig and the Slivy Toes, was Gimble and Gyre," it sounds like nonsense. And did you hear the Crack Sisters say that stuff about how they thought that he was just sharing nonsense, and then Richard Wallace is taking his writing and reshaping that into other nonsense? But I think she encapsulated this message of Lewis Carroll in a very good way. And I've heard this in other Jack the Ripper presentations on the art of crime as well. And there was even one other source that has escaped me that I'll post in the comment section if I can recall. But what they said was, and I think this is a fair way of putting it, that Lewis Carroll was trying to create a new form of logic. Or you hear all of these weird words, and he also wrote, the poem about the snark. You hear these bizarre things in weird context, but it's actually following a logical sequence. It's not just gibberish. And, it was the Short Biographies channel. There, got it. And they were actually just asking the question as a historical mystery, did Lewis Carroll have autism? And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. As Dr. Todd Grande would say, he says that this was a real person, so I'm not diagnosing anyone, only speculating as to what may have happened, and I think there's some evidence to indicate that Lewis Carroll may have had autism or he was on the spectrum, nothing wrong with that, but he was perhaps trying to rearrange language in a way where it matches up with certain sounds, and the sounds give meaning to the words in his poems and his stories. And if you just even look at Tweedledee and Tweedledum from Alice in Wonderland, that conveys so much right there. And there's just like, it's the way, what's it called, phonemic awareness, that like conveys a certain emotional connection to the person who is telling the story. And it's a fascinating way of putting it. And I really did not understand any of this until the Jack the Ripper case. So maybe that's some good that came out of this terrible, terrible story, because most of what we hear about with the Whitechapel murders is just blood and gore and cutting people apart. But we have to get back to that for a particular reason, because if you even go to Lewis Carroll's Wikipedia page, there is a section on controversies. And in the controversy section, they're looking at other historical mysteries about Lewis Carroll. Well beyond, did he have autism? Maybe he did. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That's not illegal to be autistic. But they accuse Lewis Carroll of being a pedophile. And in almost all of the sources that I've been talking about, even the Short Biographies channel that I was citing, they just also look at that. Was Lewis Carroll a pedophile? Did he have this type of infatuation with kids' stories because he was doing bad things to children? And the Short Biographies wanted to be very clear that there are some misrepresentations of Lewis Carroll's activities, like he had a quote-unquote female companion who was 18 years old, but in some historical texts it's misstated that she was 12 years old, and people have gone back through the historical records and so on, as well as looking at personal communications, and they were able to verify that. But Lewis Carroll was a lifelong bachelor. You even heard that in the Unrefined episode, and they are kind of looking at that from the way that this is the type of guy that would have gone after women because they would have been easily available, ladies of the night, all right? But at the same time, I think that might even suggest that Lewis Carroll could have been a homosexual, and this is stuff that is highly debated upon in all of these controversy sections. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that people are saying, well, was he a closeted gay man who just had to put on this facade of having female companions, and he is living a secret life? I don't necessarily know, and I also don't think the historians have come to any particular consensus about that. Now, I think that would be something really, really odd for Jack the Ripper to have been a homosexual, because he is targeting females, and a lot of serial killers tend to target victims within their own sexual orientation. However, it is not impossible. I would just be a little bit surprised. And the next one I think is a little bit more interesting. And this isn't even a real controversy either, but it's mentioned in the controversy sections on Lewis Carroll's own Wikipedia page, and that is that Lewis Carroll might have had epilepsy, and he might have experienced epileptic seizures. This is something that comes up also in Jack the Ripper discussions about how it's believed that Jack the Ripper may have had certain episodes of destructive behavior that would have come after seizures or after fits of epilepsy. And I mean, a proponent of this theory is Sarah Bax Horton, who wrote the book One-Armed Jack, but she has a different suspect named Chaim Hyams, but that's like the heart and soul of her theory about how he would have epileptic seizures, and then he would become extremely violent, to the point where his wife is making reports about this. This is all documented in the archives. She did a fascinating investigation into that all the same, no matter what the end result is, and I have an individual episode on Chaim Hyams, just called Jack the Ripper Suspect Chaim Hyams here on this channel. It's in the Suspect playlist, and I've also mentioned him on the Jack the Ripper report in the past. So, again, I think that would be a strong point in favor of Lewis Carroll being Jack the Ripper, but I'm just seeing so many things to the contrary. Listen to those audio clips again. Number one, Lewis Carroll is reported to have been someone who was very gentle, and he's not really reported to be breaking out in these types of rage-filled episodes. And the age, I think, is also completely wrong. The anagrams, I do not think, are very practical. But to give credit to the Art of Crime podcast, they did share an allegation that's made by Richard Wallace in his book, Jack the Ripper, Lighthearted Friend, and that is that Lewis Carroll might have known another Jack the Ripper suspect, and his name is Montague John Druitt. Montague John Druitt is one of the more widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspects. And again, it's a very, very good presentation on the Art of Crime podcast. They just put everything out in order. So even if people who aren't extremely familiar with the Ripper case can just dive right into it. And it's stating that in 1894, an inspector named Melville McNaughton wrote a memorandum where he was accusing, or he's listing off 3 people who he thought were good Jack the Ripper suspects, and their names were Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. And this was a private memorandum that was put into his files, and in 1921 it was actually copied by his daughter. So she copied, transcribed it, recreated it, I guess you would say. And then later on, in the mid-20th century, it became publicized for a Jack the Ripper TV show. So this is something that's looking at Montague John Druitt as a Jack the Ripper suspect. I have an episode about him as well. And he commits suicide sometime around the beginning of December of 1888. He's fired from his job on November 30th of 1888, 3 weeks after the murder of Mary Kelly, and then he commits suicide sometime between, or the end of November and the end of December, being very clear. And I'm thinking about it because we have to admit that all of these things are approximations. We don't know the exact time that Montague John Druitt died. But another part of Richard Wallace's Jack the Ripper theory is that Montague John Druitt was framed by Lewis Carroll. And this is all relating to his anagram solutions. He's also taking Montague John Druitt's writings and anagramming them and expecting that Lewis Carroll and Montague John Druitt were communicating through these anagrams. And my simple response to this is, if Lewis Carroll wanted to frame Montague John Druitt for being Jack the Ripper, he did not do a very good job. He did a piss-poor job of that, for the following reason. Montague John Druitt commits suicide by jumping in the Thames River. He had rocks placed in his pockets so he would sink to the bottom. Well, why didn't Lewis Carroll just write something saying, I was Jack the Ripper, my name was Montague John Druitt, if he wanted to frame him? I mean, wouldn't that have been simpler than these complicated anagrams that wouldn't be figured out until 1996 or something like that, when Richard Wallace put out his book, or whenever he actually made the first discoveries? Why not just do something that would have directly incriminated Montague John Druitt? I mean, I know what Richard Wallace would want to say to that this is something that he wanted to do that would have been very covert, hiding in the shadows, not necessarily revealing it, only he knows the truth, psychopathic manipulations, all of that stuff. But that's just conjecture, and I'm even being generous and stitching it together for him with all the connecting words. But I mean, that's just a very, very wild theory, in my opinion. And one of the final things that I didn't hear discussed in any of the sources that I cited was some stuff that was shared on the Jack the Ripper websites in the past. And it's one that I mentioned on the previous Jack the Ripper report, that one claim by Richard Wallace is that Lewis Carroll would write in his journal in purple ink or violet ink. And on the nights of Ripper activity, he would switch from writing in his journal in violet to writing in black. And that's one thing that was alleged by Richard Wallace. And I said this on a previous Ripper Wednesday, but I have not seen the full journal for myself, so, I mean, I just kind of have to take his word for that. Well, I mean, there could be numerous explanations, but, that is something that he did share that I think I heard on Casebook and jacktheripper.org a long time ago. But ultimately, that's going to conclude my giant rambling presentation on Lewis Carroll as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Overall, I think he's a fascinating individual. I think that he is a very interesting historical figure. There are a lot of allegations against him in many different ways. And the people who accuse Lewis Carroll of being a pedophile don't necessarily think that he was Jack the Ripper. Those are two different sets of historical problems. But there's one thing that was asked. to the audience, and this was from, I believe, the Art of Crime podcast, and that is that, does the allegation of Lewis Carroll being Jack the Ripper tarnish his legacy as a writer? And I love challenge questions. I'm going to throw it to you guys as well. Does the allegation of being Jack the Ripper tarnish Lewis Carroll's legacy as a writer? I think no, it doesn't, because it's not widely accepted. This is definitely a fringe theory, and there are many famous people who have been accused of being Jack the Ripper. Many famous authors and writers and painters. How about Walter Sickert? I have multiple episodes on him as Jack the Ripper suspect, a famous painter. Edgar Degas has also been accused of being Jack the Ripper. And the claims about Walter Sickert are taken a little bit more seriously, but these allegations against Lewis Carroll are not widely accepted, and they're mostly regarded as just something that people first want to understand. The concept of, okay, well, what's your theory? Well, why do you think that? All right, well, I don't really think so, dude, and that's where we have to leave it. But, again, if there's anything that you want to hear about on Ripper Wednesday, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below, and you can always get me on social media, but that really will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, blackboxnet88 on Facebook, blackboxnet88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there. Until next time.